Hello, everyone. Welcome to my second LinkedIn Live event. My name is Rudy Rivera, and this is Conversations with Rudy Rivera. Today, I have as my guest a 30-year prosecutor who's had a number of high-profile cases. He is now currently with the St. Louis-based law firm of Hush Blackwell. He's had many notorious cases as a prosecutor, and now he is on the other side defending the wrongfully accused. Right, Gregg?
Yes, sir.
His practice is primarily focused on white-collar criminal and also representing Fortune 500 companies on actually the title, What Happens When the Regulators Are at Your Doorstep. Many of us don't think about that. And also, many of us don't think about corporations getting in trouble until you see these big things in the news, about the Enrons, about the Bernie Madoffs, about things like that that are much more notorious. But it happens, government investigations happen a lot more than people think. Wouldn't you say so?
Yes, I mean, particularly these days, I mean, this is something that is on the increase in terms of enforcement, and the Justice Department these days has made it very clear that they're going to ramp up their efforts. They're hiring FBI agents, they're hiring prosecutors, and they intend to do a lot more regulation and a lot more criminal and civil enforcement in corporate America.
Well, why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, there's been many times been a discussion in the past about whether one administration or not has certain priorities. I mean, I think over time we've seen a slow and steady move away from the national security piece, at least the counterterrorism piece, as that threat has been diminished throughout the world. I'm not saying it's been diminished to the point of not something to worry about. It's not, and there's plenty of resources that are currently in that venue or devoted to that venue. But I think there's a expectation in this particular administration that corporate crime is going to be addressed. It's their highest priority in the Justice Department. The Attorney General of the United States has said that. I think they felt like there was more that needed to be done in this area. Typically, I think you see in a Democrat administration a little more regulation and a little more focus on corporate crime. That's certainly been the trend in the past. Taking politics out of it, it's just they've decided that this is going to be their number one priority, and they're coming after companies and the individuals who run them.
It's also extremely profitable too because the fines are very substantive.
They're amazingly high. I mean, you look at multi-billion-dollar settlements, multi-billion-dollar FCA cases, certainly hundreds of millions of dollars of FCA. That's False Claims Act cases. That's a civil enforcement. On the criminal side, you're seeing plenty of fines. So yeah, there's a lot of money for the U.S. government to collect here.
So somebody's pounding on your door. They come, government doesn't really matter what branch it is. They're coming to your door. They're there. They're at the receptionist. The receptionist is panicking, and there are some people with suits on from the government, and they want to talk to somebody important. What's the first step?
Well, I think, it's at the beginning, at least, when the investigators are literally pounding on your door. And pounding on your door in this context could mean a telephone call. It could mean receiving a subpoena, but it actually could mean pounding on your door as well, or just showing up. I can't tell you how many times my phone rings and it's somebody's telling me, an FBI agent showed up and said, I just would like to ask you a few questions. But, if the regulators or federal agents are knocking on your door, the first thing is not so much what to do, it's what not to do. And
what is that? What's the first no?
Don't panic. That is the number one thing. And Rudy, you and I have talked about this before, but, people do silly things when they panic. That's true in lots of different areas. But in this particular area, it can cause a lot of problems. So there's just many mistakes, big mistakes people make when they panic. And, that goes for your employees and your company in general. But the whole concept here is to slow things down a little bit and try to understand not to make mistakes. And the biggest mistakes that are made include saying too much, not telling the truth. And again, if you look at what happens in these investigations, the sudden onslaught of federal agents at a business or at your house often causes people to either lie or minimize their own behavior. Or occasionally we see people hiding things, trashing evidence, erasing things, not preserving things the way that they are required to under the law. And those obstruction-like charges, obstruction of justice, and lying to the agents, which is also a federal crime. It's 18 U.S.C. 1001. The obstruction charges in the 1001 cases, you see over and over and over again, people actually get in more trouble for that many times than what the underlying investigation was all about.
And I think it's because people don't ever expect that the government's going to find out. In my experience, when I did a fair amount of federal criminal cases and private practices, when the feds were asking you a question, they already knew the answer most likely, and they were just looking to corroborate.
Absolutely. And, they're trying to figure out right away when they're talking to somebody, whether or not they're telling the truth, whether they have someone in front of them who's being cooperative and helpful, or whether they have someone who's trying to hide and sneak around. And so, yes, absolutely. Some of the first questions, almost always, the agents are going to know the answer to, and all they're doing is trying to figure out whether the person in front of them is a liar or not, or is shooting straight. And so, yeah, it doesn't take long often for them to figure that out. And as we've seen occasionally, sometimes that what they're really trying to do is get leverage over the person. And so the person lying to them is actually the best thing that can happen, because once that person has lied and there's witnesses for that, you end up with a criminal case against them, and that allows the first leverage to squeeze. A lot of people don't like cooperating with criminal investigations or even civil enforcement matters, and maybe even regulatory matters. And to be able to squeeze them or exert leverage on them is a good thing for the criminal investigators many times.
Well, and the government's very good at that, squeezing people. So because oftentimes people have been there are times I've seen, a couple cases I've handled, where a person is acquitted of the underlying event. Martha Stewart's a good example. What they convicted her on was the lying. And
yeah, that happens all the time. And again, what often you don't see in the background is that lie or the threat of that prosecution is what got that person to flip or to testify or to provide evidence against the people above them. And again, this is different if the EPA potentially is showing up or some other regulator is showing up. They're not necessarily in their mind trying to build a criminal case. However, people make these terrible mistakes. They panic. They think no one's going to find out. They think I can't tell the truth. They're far better off just saying I don't want to speak at all. And that's why planning for this kind of event. And, your company probably does lots of other crisis management planning. You think about what would happen if the computers don't work. You think what would happen if we had an active shooter or a fire or a flood. Too many companies don't have any plan in place for this kind of event. And when you don't plan for something and you're in that kind of space without any kind of real planning, people panic and make mistakes.
And yeah, they've got compliance processes. They've got all kinds of processes except for what happens. And I think the big mistake is, rather than calling in-house counsel or calling outside counsel immediately, is they go to some business unit leader who panics. He doesn't know what's involved. He doesn't know how to respond. And even if he's not intentionally lying, he could still say things that they will accuse him of lying. It's funny you mentioned an EPA case, because I tried one. The last federal criminal case I tried in St. Louis, they called my client and said, "Are you dumping mud in the river?" He said, "No." Count 3, lying to EPA. Then the Army Corps of Engineers calls, says, "Are you dumping mud back in the river?" "No." Count 4. So he had 2 counts of the underlying actual bad act that they accused him of, and 3 of lying to law enforcement. So people need to understand that the government tacks those on like frosting on a cake.
Absolutely. And, add, so that's a great point, but also add to that the fact that people do what I would describe as digging a hole. They start by telling a lie, a little lie maybe, or leaving something out, which, an omission can also be prosecuted under the right circumstances if the questions are asked a certain way. And then once they start down that road, and they, let's say you told an FBI agent something that's not true, they're not in a position to start trying to fix that. That's like confessing to the lie. And so they dig a hole and they keep digging and digging and digging. They repeat the lies. They continue to add to the lies. They have to justify the lies in the rest of the story or whatever they're saying. And as you say, the government can tack on multiple counts. I've seen many cases where the person's come in 2 or 3 times, sometimes even with a lawyer, and repeated lies because they had dug that hole deep and they just couldn't dig out of it.
And it's interesting that in the case I had, they offered literally the Sunday before we were getting ready for trial, they offered my client a misdemeanor with a $10,000 fine to go away. The case at first seemed strong, but wasn't as strong. He says, nope, I'm not taking it. They're going to have to send me to jail. I'm not pleading to something I didn't do. And fortunately, after by a week of deliberation, the jury acquitted him. So not everyone's that lucky because convictions in federal court are like 98%.
Yeah, I mean, the conviction rate for the federal government is certainly in the high 90s. At trial, it's significantly less, but you got to remember a very, very tiny percentage of cases go to trial. Even in those trial cases, the government's conviction rate is very high. The federal government in particular tends to bring very strong cases. So you must have been a wonderful advocate, Rudy, because it's hard to get an acquittal in federal court. Definitely can be done. Knowing the landscape and understanding where the weak points potentially are the way to win federal cases. But it doesn't happen very often.
Well, it didn't happen often in my career. I mean, often what we did is damage control. You're looking at 50 years, the client gets 10. But back to white collar, to me, it seems the first thing to do is to say, I'm sorry, but this is a legal matter, and I have to refer this to company legal counsel.
Yeah, I mean, we counsel clients to be respectful and be cooperative, but do exactly what you're just describing. And again, there should be a protocol inside companies, big, small, and medium-sized companies should have a protocol. And the first piece of it is to call the lawyers inside the company, and eventually perhaps even lawyers outside the company so that people can show up. I mean, in my case, for instance, since I was inside the government for 30 years, to get on the phone pretty quickly with the FBI agents, just as an example, is an easy sort of routine concept. And for other people who have never been in that world, they don't necessarily know how to navigate it. They're not necessarily going to say the right things. And it's just important to have somebody immediately there who understands what the vulnerabilities are of folks on the ground.
But not even the lawyer understands. You have, for example, inside counsel who has never done any criminal work, who just says, well, we're going to cooperate. What do you need?
Yep.
To me, the response is, we want to cooperate, but we have to understand what we have. I need to do some further investigation to get you what you want. And if you can set up another time where we can discuss this, give us an opportunity to review what you're looking for, because we want to cooperate.
Yeah, I mean, so you're touching upon what I would say is the next big point, which is to try to figure out why they're there. Now, if they're there with a search warrant, you can't really tell them to leave, and they have a judge who's already said they can go rifle through whatever it is the judge said they can rifle through. Even there's a list of things that should be done, and very specific things that should be done. But sort of backing out a little bit, the big picture is try to figure out why they're there. Could be something, that's not really a threat to the people who are being interviewed or the company in general. Could be one of their employees did something outside the scope of their employment that has nothing to do really with what the company does, and doesn't really provide some sort of real threat to the company or its employees. It's just maybe about a particular person. I've seen that recently in a presentation I gave with another company. They had the FBI show up. They were interested in what this particular employee had done because he had done something wrong in another job at another time. That's one very different scenario. You really don't know why they're there. People I find are afraid to ask. And again, that's why you want somebody who's got familiarity with the agency, whatever agency it may be, or at least regulators in general, or criminal investigators in general, to ask the right questions, because there's nothing wrong with asking those questions. Many times people are just afraid to pick up the phone and say, why do you want this information? They're afraid that they can't say that. That's why you want somebody who understands the system and understands the people.
Well, but a lot of times though, Greg, they'll say, well, we're conducting an investigation and I can't tell you. But if you approach the right way, they will give you some hints of what it is. Talk to the person who's with the FBI. Look, we want to cooperate, but we got to know what you're looking for. You may not be able to tell me everything, but we as a rule, the company's going to cooperate. The company really has to cooperate, no choice. And I think it's really developing a relationship with the FBI person at the time. And people don't understand that. You have to develop a friendly relationship with this person because he may give you a break, or she.
People think that the government is made out of robots, or that there's like one particular FBI agent or one particular prosecutor, and that's not true. People are very different. There are some nasty prosecutors and nasty FBI agents. There's a lot of very friendly prosecutors and friendly FBI agents. You're absolutely right. These are people. A lot of what goes on in an investigation has to do with the relationships of the people. You're right. There are limitations to what they can say, but many times, if you have the right relationship and it's the right individuals speaking to each other, you can find out a lot of what's going on. And eventually, what you want to do is have a relationship of candor. That doesn't mean just throwing yourself at the government's mercy, but it does mean being able to have the credibility to say, look, we want to help or we want to understand, and have them come back and give you information. At the beginning, at this very beginning, the regulators are pounding on your door. The trick is to figure out as much as you can of what's going on in the background and who you're dealing with and what kind of people you're dealing with, because you may take very different approaches.
That is so true. And I've actually lived that in private practice, where I've had clients who were doing the famous proffer. And for those of you who don't know, a proffer is you spill your guts to the FBI, and if they like what they hear, they'll cut a deal with you. And my client lied the whole time. And I had to take them out and say, you're lying, and they know you're lying. So I had a great relationship with the prosecutor. So look, my client's an idiot. He lied. Can you give us another chance?
Yep.
And we got another chance.
And again, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, when I was a prosecutor, there were lawyers who I trusted and who I knew would go back and try to get to the truth and talk to their clients and come in. And we could sort of restart. There are problems with that, obviously, in calling a witness who has lied on any level. But the bottom line is, there were lawyers whom I trusted, and then there were lawyers who I knew I didn't trust. And so again, you're back to it's not a formulaic, monolithic example. It's human beings. The system is made out of human beings. We haven't even talked about the judge potentially that gets involved. Depending on what judge you have a very different case as well. And even at the very beginning, when the regulators are knocking on your door, that's something that trial lawyers are thinking about right at the very, very beginning, is what kind of trial could this be? What just happened? What about this initial interaction even between the agents and, let's say, someone at a company? How is that going to play out at trial? And it's very different. If somebody panics and lies, that's one thing. Somebody just says, I need to speak with my lawyers. I'd like you to speak to my lawyers. That's another thing. And so a trial lawyer is thinking all the way to the end. And that's another piece of this. You said there's a lot of lawyers who are inside of companies who are not necessarily well versed in the criminal system. There's also many lawyers in-house who've never tried a case. And so seeing all around the corner, if you will, is just a key piece of all this.
Well, The funny part of that is that there are more non-trial lawyers than they are trial lawyers. And so not being involved in that, it becomes difficult for you to opine on something on ground territory that you're not familiar with. It's like asking me, what's your opinion on the securities case? I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
And it's an area that many in-house counsel are not familiar with. I mean, some in compliance may be, and a number of former AUSAs or prosecutors do go work in government compliance, but that's more the exception than the rule, and they rely on outside people like you.
Yeah, and again, 90 something percent of these cases are not going to trial. But if you don't think about it, you don't have that skill set. That's not something you're familiar with. You're leaving something potentially out at the beginning, and you want to cover the whole landscape. That's why I go back to that second big piece. What is going on here is huge, and trying to get underneath and understand why these folks are here, what is exactly they're looking for, actually absolutely changes the complexion of your response. But I will tell you that over and over again, what I have seen is something that started out as a relatively routine regulatory matter has blossomed into a full-fledged criminal case that ended up in front of a federal judge. And people who think that that can't happen or haven't at least thought about that and haven't looked down the road that far are exposing the company and its employees to potential serious problems. So it's every time this happens, that question needs to be determined rather quickly: is what is going on here? And you have to make sure you don't make a big mistake at the beginning that drags something that is relatively insignificant into the realm of real trouble.
So the real takeaway is when they get to the door, number one, don't panic. Number two, don't volunteer information. Don't start like you're at the confessional. Don't start saying everything. Don't lie is the third one, because they're probably going to know. Refer the matter immediately to inside counsel or outside counsel, and cooperate as best as you can under controlled circumstances.
Right. And plan ahead. To me, that's the most important piece of all this, because if you don't have a discussion about this, you don't have a protocol. You should be able to pick up a piece of paper. Again, most companies now, even small companies, have what to do if, blank emergency takes place, the power goes out. There should be something that says, and employees should be trained on this, that if somebody shows up with a grand jury subpoena or is from a regulatory agency that you're not familiar with in particular, to do the following things, and it should say exactly that. Don't panic. Don't run your mouth and all of a sudden start confessing or lying. And mostly it's just get the right people. There are ethical obligations for lawyers. So to the extent that there are prosecutors behind the agents, and if someone shows up with a subpoena, 99 times out of 100, they're there with a subpoena that a prosecutor probably knows about already. It's not always true. Some agencies have administrative subpoena power, but many times there's a lawyer behind this, and lawyers have ethical obligations that if somebody says I'm represented by counsel, they are not permitted to talk to that person. They could lose their law license, and they're not permitted to tell the agents that they can talk to people. They could also lose their law license by telling the agents you can talk to someone who's represented by counsel. So injecting the words "my lawyers" or the company's lawyers into this conversation shuts this down many times quickly, and at least puts a pause on it long enough for the right people to get into the right positions to try to find out what's going on.
Well, saying your representative's like the automatic shutoff valve. They have to stop.
Yep.
The federal prosecutor is an attorney. Many FBI agents are also attorneys. Others are accountants. So you're not dealing with, law enforcement from a different municipality that just has law enforcement training. They risk their law licenses with that.
Absolutely.
That shuts them down. Taking the fifth, I have mixed feelings about that, because most human nature, normally I would recommend take the fifth. But when you say, I'm taking the fifth right now, I'm not saying anything, I think it's a mistake to say at the very beginning. You might take it when you're under subpoena, but when they're at your doorstep, you just I do want to cooperate. I need time. I got to consult with local council, company council, and that's really what gets you in a mode not to panic. You've already halted, but if you have to make those decisions quickly, it's your head spinning.
Yeah, in this context, you're not really taking the fifth. That's sort of a vernacular way of saying it, but you're
Yeah.
right. You say that to somebody at the very beginning. What you're saying by invoking the Fifth Amendment is that I may incriminate myself or will incriminate myself. And so immediately that's going to perk up the agents or the prosecutor's ears, and they say, well, first time we went and talked to this guy, he said I might incriminate myself. There must be something there where he's worried about actually incriminating himself. So I agree. Saying the words, I'll take the fifth on this. But these are, again, this is what happens in a panic situation. People just say something like that. Hey, I'd have to take the fifth on that, right?
Yeah.
People say that in their day-to-day conversation sometimes because it's just a saying. But in a context where there's a federal agent in front of you, saying I'm going to take the fifth is going to implicate for them the idea that you're potentially a criminal. So I think you put it well. You want to be polite. You want to indicate you're wanting to be cooperative. You need to try to slow things down and get a lawyer who knows what's going on, knows the agencies, knows how to deal with these folks, injected into this as quickly as possible to try to find out what's going on.
We can have a whole 5-hour course on this, what to do from start to finish. This could be a whole series because it's not a simple thing.
No.
And it's not just, I mean, the investigations include corrupt foreign practices. It includes bribery. It includes stock manipulation. I mean, there's all kinds of federal crimes. It's like a gumball. Drop a quarter in and see what crime comes out.
Yeah. And, again, it is not unusual to see it evolve over time, that the government comes in one capacity or another and is investigating A and starts on peeling back layers of the onion and then starts investigating B. People think that that one agency is speaking for the entire government. That is incorrect as well. It is not unusual at all to see 2 or 3 agencies involved in various different aspects of investigatory work. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not, and they don't even talk to each other. They don't even know what the other one is doing.
Well, you're looking at penalties of violation different sides of the law. I mean, more than just one statute's being violated, and a separate agency is investigating each violation of that statute.
That's right. And sometimes they're competing with each other knowingly. Sometimes they're cooperating with each other. Sometimes, as I said, they don't even know each other are out there. And so this can get extremely complicated extremely quickly. And again, you want somebody who understands that landscape. I have seen, as just an example of, some of the complexities of this, I've seen people who have cooperated in good faith with Agency A. And then Agency A has given that information to Agency B, and Agency B has used it to come after the company or come after the person. So
Right,
everything was working out great on the cooperation end until a new group of people got involved and decided to come after the company harder. So even understanding that dynamic is extremely important.
Sure, you'd want to ask if you have a cooperating agreement, you'd want immunity from any type of prosecution, from any agency.
Yep.
And unless you know the federal system and the breakdown of the different enforcement authority that they have, you could be okay with the Securities Exchange Commission, but you're not okay with the Justice Department.
That's right. And there's just a huge mosaic of civil, administrative, and federal agencies out there. They're criminal agencies, federal criminal enforcement agencies. That doesn't even include your local attorney general's office decides to jump into this, or the local police department is somehow involved. So it can get very ugly very quickly. And you're absolutely right. What you're looking for always is a universal ending to this, something that everyone can live with and everyone can walk away from without having exposed folks to real trouble.
Well, and you want really outside counsel to also do the investigation and protect the privilege, because what happens in inside counsel, there's the attorney-client privilege, but I think there's also additional belt and suspenders when you have something being directed by outside counsel. Somebody who is a former AUSA, or somebody who's got a lot of experience in white collar crime, who already has a relationship with law enforcement, because you I mean, you develop relationships during the course of your career trying cases. And if you're well respected, or you're trusted, then that's a benefit to the company. When you're talking to some guy like me, for example, I practice in St. Louis criminally, but here they don't know who I am.
Yeah.
I'd have to get somebody.
Well, and trust is, as we've started off saying, the relationships and trust is a huge piece. The government really doesn't necessarily want to do the work of checking every single thing out. So having someone on the other side who's actually doing all of that work and that you can trust saves time, and it gives a prosecutor or an agent at least the ability to sort of cut some corners and say, I don't have to deal with this. Someone else is looking into it. I can focus on the things that person's not focusing on the inside. And, having outside counsel, they're really, you put your finger on it. There's really two big things. It tends to preserve the privilege more securely. And you really want to preserve the attorney-client privilege during this. There's a lot of litigation, a lot of cases, a lot of interesting developments in this area of the law about whether or not an internal investigation, they actually are able to maintain the privilege or not. And sometimes again, you want to go slowly here and carefully. And the last thing you want to do is blow the privilege early on or even in the middle, and then have that all subject to a subpoena from the government if it's not something the company wants or should turn over. The other thing is just the optics, and you pointed to one aspect of the optics, which is if it's a trusted person in the government, and I explain why it is that trusted person could be very helpful to the company and also to the government at the same time. It just sort of bridges some of the gap. It also just looks better sometimes to have an outside entity come in and look at what's going on versus having the company do it itself. So there are optics reasons why sometimes you want an outside counsel. And you'll see in most of these big government investigations, whether it's on the regulatory side or on the criminal side or on the administrative side or on the civil side, you'll see outside counsel come in many times and do the investigative work.
Well, I mean, in closing up here, Greg, it's important because in my opinion, inside counsel is an expression we use, drinks the Kool-Aid. And there have been a number of people prosecuted, even attorneys, who never thought they committed a crime.
Yep.
And, oh, you mean what I did was illegal when it seemed like it was a transaction? You don't know what you don't know. Yep. So you need somebody with that set of eyes has experience in those criminal facets of what is illegal. Sometimes that's even questionable. There are things you do that you don't think it's illegal.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I've never been an inside counsel, a corporate counsel inside. Rudy, you're obviously in a different position. But I would think, like many things in life, maybe the most important thing is to know what you don't know, and
exactly
not step into the dark black hole that you don't understand. And in this context, doing that with all these landmines out there is just extremely dangerous. So, I think you're right. I think people need to know what they don't know and find experts who actually do know.
Exactly. Well, Greg, you have a podcast called The Justice Insiders.
I do. And, the whole idea is I spent 30 years inside the government. Many of my colleagues at Hush Blackwell have as well, spent significant time inside the government. And it's an attempt to sort of give folks the perspective of what it's like to be on the other side. As you've pointed out, many times the government's not going to tell you what's going on. They're not going to tell you why they're there. They're not going to tell you what they're thinking. And it's just a way of looking at things a little differently from folks who've been doing it for decades, can explain the insider perspective. We think it helps our clients to have that expertise, but it also can be sort of interesting to hear the mindset of the folks who've had that job.
I've listened to his podcast, to Gregg's podcast. It's really informative. It's had some celebrity guests on there. It's the Justice Insiders at Hush Blackwell website. I don't know how often do you publish, or do you?
We're averaging probably 2 a month. It's not like a regular tick. I'm not Joe Rogan. It's not my full-time job, but we've managed to get about 2 out every month. and you can get it on Apple Podcasts or any other place that you listen to podcasts.
Well, there's a link to the website that will take you to the podcast. You can see it right there. Gregg, thank you so much. There were some great takeaways from this. Really appreciate you coming on, especially early in the morning, because you start at 7:30 San Antonio time. And if I'm ever in trouble, Gregg, you're the one I'm calling. I just hope I never need you for that.
Me too, Rudy. But look, I've really enjoyed it, and I really do appreciate you bringing me on. Maybe we'll do it again.
No problem. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Take care.